Hey, what's up guys? This is Brian at Whisper Status 74. Welcome to the community, welcome to the channel. This video will be a goodbye video to the 75-inch Sony 900E. This will be the last video that I have featuring it before I donate it. This is a goodbye video to one of the best panels ever made. It is actually also the panel that I never wanted and ended up being one of my favorite panels of all time.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel, welcome to the community. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. This is an important video for me. This is actually, as I mentioned in the intro, the goodbye to one of my favorite panels of all time. This was the Sony 900E behind me. Its replacement will be an 83-inch LG C1, but I wanted to say goodbye to this panel properly. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to this channel, why this channel actually exists, and I'll explain a little bit of the journey with the 900E because I actually feel like you guys can learn something from the journey that this panel has been through with me. I started YouTube with a couple displays before the 900E. I had a string of defective panels, and it's the reason why I started this whole community and trying to help people find their favorite TV. The reason why the 900E is special to me is it's a panel that I actually didn't want. It was actually, by default, it was my last choice. It was basically all there was left to choose during that specific year. The year started in 2016. It was a Vizio P-Series that was a highly rated TV at the time, and I had had 3 or 4 of those. They were defective, and then I started this trend of spending my way out of it. I purchased then a Samsung KS9000, the big brother to the legendary Samsung KS8000. Much like the 900E, the KS8000 is another beloved popular display. The challenge is the KS9000 at that size was still edge-lit, way too bright, a lot of problems with flash lighting, dead pixels, banding. I mean, it was an absolute mess. I went through a few of those as I learned the issues of TVs. Ended up with a KS9500, which was edge-lit and curved. I kept trying to spend my way through it. Then I finally ended up with the KS9800, which was full array. At this point, I think the price point I was at was a little over $9,000. The Z9D was also out at that point. And it was so disheartening to go through all these panels. Now, I know for many of you watching this, that's way too much money, especially now when you think about what these panels cost. I mean, this is more than an A90J. But at the time, what I want to illustrate to you was how I started with a certain budget of $4,000, which was not very expensive, but it was a value for 75 inches at the time, which is insane. But how without YouTube and without, even though I was doing my research, there was nowhere there to help me. So I was basically just trying to buy my way through, and I went with Samsung, which was my favorite at the time. Which is ironic at the time, is I really didn't like Sony. I'd followed Sony years ago with the Sony Trinitron Grand Vega, which was one of my favorite TVs, but I really was pretty bored with them. There was nothing about them I really liked other than the PlayStation at that time. So I was in contact with ratings.com. If I can find it in my Facebook Messenger, I'll put that up on the screen now, but they were helping me along the way, and they had steered me towards the Sony 940E. Now, what's interesting about the 900E, quickly to interrupt this story, was it wasn't even the best TV in its lineup. There was all this debate back then of it being mid-range, mid-high range. The fact of the matter is it was the Sony 900E, the Sony 930E, the Sony 940E, and the Sony Z9D, which blanketed a few years as a Master Series. At the time, the Sony Z9D was $9,000. The 940E was a flat $4,000. This is after the year, this is 2017. The 930E, which was also extremely popular, very bright, extremely vivid. Also, it was edge-lit. didn't come in a 75. So it was a really weird year where the 900E was kind of by itself at 75 and had a full array, local dimming, also had a lot of sizes that it offered, but it wasn't the highest end. The 940E was the baby Z9D. The 930E was sandwiched in there, competing directly with the KS8000. Very bright. That's the TV that I wanted so badly, but it didn't come in 75. So I ended up with the 940E. Ratings.com told me that it had a slow pixel response. You may see some blurring, I should say. But the point is, I bought that TV. That was one of the very first TVs on the channel. If you go back to my original videos, is the KS9800 with terrible blurring and vertical banding and this blue light. Then there was the Sony 940E, which had some pretty heavy blurring for me with gaming. Otherwise, I was happy with it. But the point of this whole story is by the time I get to the Sony 900E, Ratings had referred it to me, told me it was a great pick. It wasn't the sexiest of the group. It wasn't the brightest. It wasn't the best. It didn't have Dolby Vision, which was arriving to the 940E, the Z9D, and the 930E. So it didn't have any of those features, but they promised that it was a very good, solid overall pick. Now, if you watch the very first video I did on the 900E, I am very underwhelmed. It's a Call of Duty, I think it's a Modern Warfare remaster, and I'm just talking and I'm holding the camera with my hands, and it was good all around. And with that said, it became one of the best panels I have ever owned. And that's something that I want you guys to hear and think about when you're making your TV purchase. Sometimes we reach for the highest end, the sexiest pick, the highest nits, the more zones, the more features. And sometimes it's that best all around. To me, in my humble opinion, the Sony 900E that year was the best all around panel. It had the fastest pixel response. It was the best value. It came in the largest size, other than the 940E and Z9D, which were more expensive and had a slower pixel response. So the 900E came in at this mid-level. It wasn't the best looking, but it was a good looking enough. And I had years and years of enjoyment from it. The challenge of going to it, though, is I had been at the top of the heap. I had been from the Vizio P series up to the KS9800, which was 78 inches. It was curved, it was full array, and it's probably one of the best looking panels I had ever seen, even to this day. And I had it here in my home. It was heartbreaking to have to quit on it. Again, if you go back to my earlier videos, you'll see the KS9800 with blue light going down the screen. It's actually a pretty well-known issue with Samsung back then, but it broke my heart to have to go backwards. And as I mentioned in my direct messages to Artings, I really didn't want to buy the Sony. I was pretty cold on Sony, as I just mentioned. There was nothing about them that I really, really liked. And I was so happy that I went with this panel. It ended up being one of the most popular LEDs ever made. Many of you still have this panel. And why I think this panel is still good today is that Sony's focus at the time was to compete with OLED, which was on the horizon. Sony's focus at that time was black levels. It wasn't where it is now, where shadow detail is its main focus. Back then, with the 940E, the 930E, the Z90, it was all about blooming being eliminated. There was very little blooming on the Z90, very little at all on the 940E. And even though the 930E was edge-lit, it was this hybrid edge-lit full array combination that also handled blooming. Sony's direction at that time, as I mentioned, was combating OLED. The A1E was just coming out. That was their first foray, even though Sony had basically discovered OLED years and years before. It was more about being its own LED monster, where now their lineup is mostly, even though we have the Z9J, the X95, and the X90, and all these other panels, OLED is pretty much their primary focus, and their LEDs are focused on shadow detail. But back then, it was such a great overall panel. It was very bright. It wasn't the brightest, but it was nearly 1,000 nits. I have the 75-inch. In my opinion, it probably reaches 1,000 nits. It was very accurate. It was also a joy to game on, having a very fast pixel response without any blurring. The input lag was decent. It wasn't great, but it was decent, and it was very playable. I've spent a lot of time with this panel and I've watched movies, games, and for a good part of my YouTube career, this is the panel that I sat in front of and spoke. And even when I didn't have other TVs to show you, the 900E was in the video as I spoke about other panels as a placeholder. I am very grateful to this panel. This panel is why I have a YouTube channel. I referred many of you to this panel. Many of you were very, very happy with it. But for me, this panel was the savior. It was the one that kept me into home theater. It was the one that I didn't want to be with. It was the one that I reluctantly went with that ended up being one of the best I had ever seen. And it solved all the issues of all the other panels that cost 2-3 times as much. And it was a great lesson for me. You don't have to always go with the highest end. You don't have to always chase what the best is. And at that time, TV YouTubers were kind of in their infancy. It was still a lot of written reviews, and I remember reading every review I could get my hands on about those other panels, and all those other panels were the end-all be-all. They were the brightest, they were the best once you had them. And what's funny is every single one of those panels, as vibrant and as beautiful as they were, they had huge drawbacks. As I mentioned, the Samsungs at the time had flashlighting like you guys would not believe, literal flashlights shooting through the screen. You had these column banding, DSE, dead pixels. The Sony was the first out of this entire group that I was actually happy with. I only had one 900E. That's the panel that I have here. Even the 940E that I had, even though it had a slow pixel response, the picture quality I was happy with, but I had a huge vertical band right down the center that can also be seen here on the channel. And the reason why I want to say goodbye to this panel is it's mine. This isn't a panel that was on loan to me. This isn't a panel that you see now with so many people on this platform buying TVs, reviewing them, sending them back. There's no ownership anymore. This is mine. This is one that I have without any help. This is the one I could only afford at the time. And even though I spent much more money, I went beyond my means to try and capture perfection. I went above my budget, and many of you are in the same mode. Buying TVs that you could barely afford, it's hard to be happy with them when you have buyer's remorse, especially when they don't meet your expectations. The Sony 900E is a display that I didn't want. It's a display that I didn't need, and it was one that was easily affordable, and it wasn't something that I was wowed by, but it was one that really made me happy, and I am very grateful to it, and I'm grateful to all you guys that love this panel. And it is sad for me to say goodbye to it. It's sad for me to replace it and to move on to something else. It is going to a local family in need that will love it as much, if not more, than I did. But the lesson here is you don't have to spend the most. It's all about what you like. Be content with what you have. Don't overextend yourself. Don't get yourself into buyer's remorse. But once you get it, enjoy it and love it. And I absolutely love the Sony 900E. And this is my goodbye, and it's my love letter and my I love you. It's one of the best panels that I've ever seen, that I've ever had, that I didn't want, but I'm so glad I had it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you in the comments. Take care.